The first time the police showed up at my door, I honestly thought they had the wrong address. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee still steaming in my hand, when loud, aggressive knocking rattled the front door like it might come off the hinges. Before I could even reach it, a voice shouted, "Police department, open the door now." My heart dropped straight into my stomach. I'd never had so much as a parking ticket in my life, let alone a reason for the cops to be banging on my door at 8 in the morning. When I opened it, 2 officers stood there, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning past me into my home, as if they expected to see something illegal in plain sight. One of them asked my name, then told me they had received an anonymous tip that I was dealing drugs out of my house. I actually laughed at first, thinking it had to be some kind of sick joke, but the looks on their faces told me they weren't amused. They asked if they could step inside and talk. I let them in, confused, nervous, and already feeling that strange, creeping fear that comes when you realize someone out there is actively trying to ruin your life. As they questioned me, my mind raced through every possible explanation. I worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, and my days were boring, predictable, and painfully normal. The most suspicious thing I'd done recently was order takeout 3 nights in a row. The officers asked if I noticed a lot of foot traffic around my house, if people came and went at odd hours, if I had packages delivered frequently. That last question made something click. My neighbor, the woman who lived directly across the street, had been watching me like a hawk for months. She was the type who stood behind her curtains, peeking through just enough to see without being seen. Complained about everything: cars parked too close to her driveway, trash bins left out too long, kids making noise in the afternoon. We'd barely spoken, but I knew her reputation on the block. Everyone avoided her, and now standing there with 2 cops in my living room, I suddenly knew exactly who had called them. I explained everything calmly, showed them my home office, my computer setup, my invoices and client emails. They could see for themselves there was nothing even remotely drug-related going on. After about 20 minutes, the tension eased. One of the officers actually apologized, saying they had to follow up on every call they received. Before leaving, though, the younger officer paused and said something that sent a chill through me. He mentioned the caller claimed to have seen suspicious packages being moved regularly and insisted I was using mail deliveries as cover. The word mail stuck in my head long after they left. I thanked them, closed the door, and stood there in silence, my heart still pounding. I had been cleared, but the damage was already done. Someone had tried to label me a criminal, and I had no idea how far they were willing to go. Over the next few days, things got worse. Patrol cars started driving slowly past my house once, or twice a day. I noticed neighbors giving me strange looks, conversations stopping when I walked by. The invisible accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I kept my head down, telling myself it would blow over, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. The woman across the street, Karen, as people half-jokingly called her, seemed almost energized. She stood outside more often, phone in hand, watching me like she was waiting for me to slip up. Every package delivered to my porch made my stomach twist. I started bringing them inside immediately, worried about how it looked. It was exhausting, living under constant suspicion, especially when I had done absolutely nothing wrong. One afternoon, a week after the first police visit, I was working at my desk when I heard shouting outside. I looked through the window and saw Karen arguing with the mail carrier. She was pointing toward my house, her face red, arms flailing dramatically. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could guess. Something inside me snapped. I went outside, staying on my side of the street, and asked what the problem was. She turned on me instantly, accusing me of scamming the postal service and running something illegal. The mail carrier looked uncomfortable and just wanted to finish his route. I told her to stop harassing people and mind her own business. She screamed that she was protecting the neighborhood and that everyone would thank her once the truth came out. That was the moment I realized she wasn't just nosy, she was obsessed. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering how a normal, quiet life could spiral so fast. I worried about my job, my reputation, even my safety. False accusations have a way of sticking, no matter how innocent you are. Decided then that if she was determined to drag my name through the mud, I wasn't going to just sit back and take it. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, patrol cars passing by, her confrontations, the way she filmed my house from her driveway. I didn't know yet how important those notes would become, but something told me I'd need proof. Sooner rather than later. A few days later, the police came again. This time they were more serious. Same accusation, same supposed evidence, all coming from the same caller. I was angry now, not scared. I calmly showed them my documentation, explained the ongoing harassment, and pointed directly across the street. The officers exchanged looks. One of them asked if Karen had issues with other neighbors. I told them everything I knew. That's when the tone shifted. They said they'd take a closer look at the situation. I watched them walk across the street and knock on her door. She opened it with a smug smile, like she'd been waiting for this moment. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw her confidence slowly fade. Her gestures became sharper, more defensive. One officer stepped into her garage, and that's when things truly began to unravel in ways none of us could have imagined. At that moment, I didn't yet know what they were about to find, or how completely the tables were about to turn. I knew was that the truth was finally coming to the surface, and once it did, nothing on this street would ever be the same again. If you want to hear how a false accusation led to a discovery that shocked everyone involved, stay with me and keep listening, because this story is only just beginning. From my front window, I watched the officer step into Karen's garage. Something about the way their posture changed told me this was no longer a routine visit. At first, Karen kept talking, her voice loud enough to carry across the street, insisting she had done nothing wrong and that she was just being a concerned citizen. But then one officer bent down near a stack of cardboard boxes pushed against the back wall. Another shone a flashlight into the darker corner of the garage. The smugness drained from Karen's face so quickly, it was almost frightening. Her words slowed, then stopped altogether. She crossed her arms tightly, shifting her weight from foot to foot, suddenly no longer in control of the situation. She had created. I felt a strange mix of anxiety and grim satisfaction. Not because I wanted her in trouble, but because for the first time, someone was finally looking somewhere other than my house. The officers began pulling boxes out, one by one. From a distance, I could see printed labels, envelopes, and what looked like bundles of mail bound together with rubber bands. Karen started talking again, faster this time, claiming it was just old stuff and things people didn't want. The officer closest to her asked a simple question that made my breath catch. Why are these addressed to dozens of different people? Karen laughed nervously and said she was helping neighbors who couldn't be bothered to deal with their mail. Even from across the street, I could tell the explanation wasn't landing. The officers exchanged another look, the kind that says more than words ever could. One of them stepped outside and spoke into his radio, his voice low and controlled. As they continued searching, more mail appeared. Stacks of envelopes, small packages, padded mailers, all addressed to people who lived on our street and nearby blocks. Some envelopes looked old, edges yellowed, while others were clearly recent, with fresh tracking stickers still attached. I recognized a few names immediately, people I knew. Neighbors who had complained in passing about missing bills or packages that never arrived. My stomach tightened as the realization set in. While Karen was busy accusing me of crimes I hadn't committed, she had apparently been hoarding other people's mail right under everyone's noses. The irony was so thick it almost felt unreal. Karen's voice rose in pitch, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain. She claimed she was collecting evidence, that she believed the postal service was unreliable, and she was keeping things safe. One officer asked why she hadn't contacted the postal inspectors. If she was so concerned, she had no answer for that. Instead, she turned her frustration toward me, pointing across the street and yelling that this was somehow my fault, that I had forced her hand. Hearing my name dragged into it again made my hands clench at my sides, even now caught red-handed. She couldn't stop trying to shift blame. More police arrived, including a supervisor. Neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. Curtains moved, doors opened, and soon half the block was watching as boxes of stolen mail were carried out of Karen's garage and placed carefully on the sidewalk. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. People whispered names, pointing out addresses they recognized. I saw shock, anger, and confusion on their faces. A few looked at me, then back at Karen, their expressions changing as pieces finally fell into place. The silent judgment I'd felt directed at me for days began to evaporate, replaced by something else entirely. One neighbor, an older man who lived 2 houses down, stepped forward and asked if the officers had found his missing pension checks. Another woman burst into tears when she recognized a package she'd been waiting on for weeks. The officers took statements, trying to keep order as emotions flared. Karen stood rigid, arms crossed, her face flushed, and eyes darting around like a trapped animal. She insisted over and over that she was being misunderstood, that she was the real victim, but no one was listening anymore. The evidence was too obvious, too overwhelming. An officer approached me and asked if I'd noticed anything strange about Karen before all this started. I told him about the constant watching, the filming, the accusations, and the repeated calls to the police. He nodded slowly, jotting notes, then said something that made my chest loosen for the first time in days. He apologized not just for the inconvenience, but for the stress the false reports must have caused. He explained that knowingly making false police reports was a serious offense, especially when it tied up resources and targeted an innocent person. Hearing that felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For once, someone in authority was acknowledging the harm she'd done. To me, as the investigation continued, postal inspectors were contacted. The officers explained that mail theft was a federal crime. The scale of what they were seeing suggested this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. Karen's protests grew quieter, then turned into outright denial. She claimed the mail had just shown up in her garage, that she didn't know how it got there. The absurdity of the claim only seemed to make things worse for her. The officers carefully photographed everything, cataloging addresses, dates, and quantities. The pile on the sidewalk grew larger and larger, a physical manifestation of months, maybe years of stolen correspondence. I stood there feeling oddly detached, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. A week ago, I was the suspected criminal, the whispered about neighbor. Now, the truth was laid bare in full view of everyone who had doubted me. Some neighbors approached quietly to apologize for believing the rumors or for not speaking up sooner. I told them it was okay, though part of me knew I'd never forget how quickly suspicion had spread. Trust, once shaken, doesn't fully return overnight. As dusk settled in, Karen was escorted to the back of a patrol car. She was still talking, still insisting she'd done nothing wrong, her voice cracking with a mix of anger and fear. The door closed, cutting her off mid-sentence. The flashing lights reflected off nearby houses, casting long shadows across the street. The officers assured everyone that the stolen mail would be processed and, where possible, returned to its rightful owners. They also told us this was likely just the beginning of a much larger investigation. When the street finally quieted down, I went back inside my house and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. Relief washed over me, but it was tangled with exhaustion and disbelief. The same person who had tried so hard to paint me as a criminal had been committing a serious crime herself the entire time. It felt surreal, like some twisted cautionary tale about obsession and projection. I didn't know what would happen next, how long the legal process would take, or how this would ultimately affect our neighborhood. What I did know was that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how buried it seemed. And as the night settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story was far from over, and that the consequences of Karen's actions were only just beginning to unfold. The next morning, the street felt different, like the air itself had shifted. Where there had been tension and suspicion, there was now a quiet, uneasy calm. People stepped outside more than usual, lingering by their driveways, exchanging hushed conversations that stopped the moment someone new approached. I could feel eyes on me again, but this time they carried sympathy instead of judgment. A few neighbors waved or nodded, gestures that felt small but meaningful after everything that had happened. Inside my house, though, I was still on edge. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family who had heard bits and pieces of the story and wanted to know if I was okay. I told them I was fine, but the truth was, I felt wrung out, like I'd lived a month's worth of stress in just a few days. Later that day, an officer returned to take a more detailed statement from me. He asked about the first police visit, the accusations, and every interaction I'd had with Karen over the past several months. As I spoke, I realized just how long the pattern had been building. The constant watching, the complaints, the confrontations, all painted a picture of someone who had been escalating for a while. The officer explained that my documentation would be important, not only for the false reports, but also to establish a timeline of her behavior. Hearing that made me grateful. I'd trusted my instincts and written everything down. Small details I might have dismissed as petty or harmless now carried real weight. By the afternoon, postal inspectors arrived to canvass the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, asking residents if they'd experienced missing or delayed mail. One by one, stories came pouring out. People talked about bills that never arrived, replacement credit cards that vanished, legal notices that showed up weeks late or not at all. Each story added another layer to the growing case. I stood nearby as one inspector carefully explained how serious mail theft was, how it could affect people's finances, credit, and even legal standing. The anger in some neighbors' voices was palpable. What Karen had done wasn't just annoying or invasive, it had caused real harm. As more information came out, it became clear that Karen hadn't just targeted random mail. She seemed particularly interested in packages and envelopes that looked official or valuable. Some neighbors suspected she had been looking for checks, financial documents, or anything that could give her leverage or information. The thought sent a chill through me. It wasn't hard to imagine her standing over piles of stolen mail, sorting through other people's private lives, while convincing herself she was somehow justified. The same self-righteousness that fueled her false accusations against me had likely fueled this too. That evening, I was invited over to a neighbor's house for an impromptu gathering. People brought snacks, coffee, and stories, it felt like. A strange mix of support group and block party, everyone processing what had happened together. Several neighbors apologized directly, some with tears in their eyes, for not questioning the rumors sooner, or for silently believing Karen's version of events. I accepted their apologies, but I also shared how isolating it had felt to be on the receiving end of those suspicions. The conversation turned serious as we talked about how isolating a single voice, repeated often enough, could shape perception. It was a sobering realization for everyone there. Despite the support, I struggled to relax. Every knock at the door made my heart jump. I kept replaying the image of police officers at my doorstep, the way their presence had instantly turned my safe, familiar space into something threatening. Trauma doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just a constant hum of anxiety that refuses to fade. I found myself double-checking locks, peering out windows, listening for sounds that might not even be there. The rational part of me knew I had been cleared, but emotions don't always listen to logic. A few days later, I received a call from the police department informing me that Karen had been formally charged. They didn't go into detail, but they confirmed it involved multiple counts related to mail theft and false reporting. The officer also mentioned that there could be a court date where I might be asked to testify about the false accusations and the impact they had on me. Hanging up the phone, I felt another wave of conflicting emotions. Part of me was relieved that there was accountability, that what she'd done wasn't being brushed aside. Another part of me dreaded the idea of reliving everything in a courtroom, of facing her again and reopening wounds I was just beginning to bandage. As news spread, the neighborhood dynamic continued to evolve. Karen's house sat dark and quiet, her driveway empty. It was unsettling to see a place that had once been the source of so much noise and scrutiny now completely still. Some neighbors expressed guilt, wondering how they'd missed the signs or dismissed complaints about missing mail as simple mistakes. Others were angry, feeling betrayed by someone they'd trusted, even if only in a casual, neighborly way. The sense of community, though shaken, slowly rebuilding through shared outrage and a desire to protect one another going forward. Through all of this, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to serious consequences for something I hadn't done. A few more convincing lies, a less thorough investigation, and my life could have been derailed in ways that are hard to undo. That realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. It made me think about how many people don't get the chance to clear their names so completely, how many live under suspicion because someone else decided to point a finger. The injustice of that sat heavy with me, fueling both gratitude and lingering anger. As the days passed, I tried to return to my routine. Work deadlines didn't care about neighborhood drama. Normal life had a way of pushing forward whether I was ready or not. Still, everything felt slightly off, like a familiar song played in a different key. I knew the legal process would take time and that this chapter wasn't fully closed yet. Karen's actions had set something in motion that couldn't simply be undone, and I was now part of it whether I liked it or not. What I didn't realize then was that the deeper the investigation went, the more disturbing details would emerge, revealing motives and behaviors that would make her accusations against me seem like only a small part of a much darker pattern. As the investigation pushed forward, details began to surface that painted an even more unsettling picture of what had been happening right under our noses. Postal inspectors returned with follow-up questions, and this time they weren't just asking about missing mail. They wanted to know about Karen's behavior over the years, her routines, and any odd habits people might have noticed. Neighbors started recalling things they had brushed off before, how she always seemed to know when deliveries were scheduled, how she lingered outside during peak mail hours, how she complained loudly whenever a package sat unattended for even a few minutes. What once seemed like annoying vigilance now looked disturbingly calculated. The more people talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment, but a pattern that had been evolving for a long time. I was contacted again, this time by a detective assigned to coordinate the false reporting aspect of the case. He asked me to describe in detail how the accusations had affected my life. As I spoke, I found myself more emotional than I expected. I talked about the fear, the humiliation, the way suspicion had crept into everyday interactions. I explained how my work had suffered because I couldn't focus, how I'd been afraid to even check my mail without wondering how it looked from across the street. The detective listened carefully, nodding, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he told me that my experience mattered, that false accusations could be as damaging as some crimes themselves. Hearing that validation from someone whose job was to deal with facts and evidence meant more to me than I'd realized. Meanwhile, more victims came forward. Some lived just outside our immediate neighborhood, people whose mail routes overlapped. With ours, they shared stories of identity theft scares, missed court dates, late fees, and credit issues that traced back to missing mail. Each new account added weight to the case, expanding it far beyond a single street dispute. Investigators began to suspect that Karen had used the stolen mail not only to satisfy her sense of control, but possibly to gather information. The idea that she might have been sorting through personal documents, financial records, and private correspondence made my skin crawl. It reframed her accusations against me as something darker in an attempt to divert attention, to create a convenient villain while she continued her own activities unnoticed. The neighborhood atmosphere grew heavier as this possibility set in. Conversations turned from gossip to genuine concern about personal safety and privacy. People installed locking mailboxes, security cameras, and delivery alerts. There was a collective sense of betrayal, not just by Karen, but by the illusion that this kind of thing couldn't happen in a quiet, ordinary place like ours. I noticed how trust, once broken, forced everyone to become a little more guarded. Even friendly interactions now carried an undercurrent of caution, as if we were all relearning how to coexist. In the middle of all this, I received notice that Karen's attorney had requested access to my statements and documentation. The idea that my notes, my words, and my experience would be scrutinized by someone looking to undermine them made my stomach knot. I was advised to be careful about what I shared publicly and to direct any questions to the authorities. It felt surreal to think that after being falsely accused, I now had to defend my truth in a formal legal setting. Still, I reminded myself that facts were on my side, and that careful documentation had already proven its value once. As weeks passed, small but telling details continued to emerge. Investigators discovered that Karen had filed numerous complaints with various agencies over the years, not just about me, but about other neighbors as well. Noise complaints, zoning issues, safety concerns, many of them unsubstantiated. It became clear that she had a history of using authority as a weapon, leveraging reports and accusations to exert control over those around her. Realizing this reframed the entire situation. I wasn't uniquely targeted because of something I'd done. I was simply the latest focus of a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. This realization brought a strange sense of relief. It wasn't personal, even if it felt deeply personal at the time. Understanding that helped me let go of some of the self-doubt I'd been carrying. I hadn't invited this, caused it, or deserved it. I had just been unlucky enough to cross paths with someone whose need for control outweighed her regard for truth or consequence. That perspective didn't erase the damage, but it did make it easier to breathe. The legal process, however, showed no signs of slowing down. I was informed that there would likely be multiple hearings, and that the mail theft charges alone could take a long time to resolve due to their scope. Karen remained out of sight, but her presence lingered in every update, every official letter, every phone call. It was like living with a shadow that refused to disappear. I found myself longing for closure, for a definitive end to the story. But the system moved at its own pace, indifferent to my desire for normalcy. Despite everything, there were moments of unexpected growth. Neighbors began organizing watch groups, not in a paranoid way, but as a means of rebuilding trust and looking out for one another. People shared information, checked in on each other, and made a conscious effort to communicate openly instead of relying on assumptions. Watching that shift gave me a cautious sense of hope. Something harmful had been exposed, and in its place, there was an opportunity to create something better. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't reached the bottom of this yet. Each new detail seemed to hint at deeper motivations, at a mindset that went beyond simple nosiness or misguided vigilance. As I prepared myself mentally for court proceedings and the possibility of facing Karen again, I wondered what she would say in her own defense and whether she even understood the damage she had caused. The truth had come a long way already, but I sensed there were still revelations. Ahead, ones that would force all of us to confront just how dangerous, unchecked accusations and obsession could truly be. The first court date arrived quietly, without the dramatic buildup I had imagined during so many sleepless nights. Walking into the courthouse, I felt a tightness in my chest, a mix of nerves and resolve. The building smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, and every sound echoed just a little too loudly. I wasn't there to accuse anyone. I was there to tell the truth. Still, the weight of the situation pressed down on me. This was no longer just a neighborhood conflict. It was a legal matter with real consequences, and my experience was now part of an official record. Karen sat at the defense table when I entered the courtroom. She looked smaller than I remembered, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed straight ahead. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered the fear, the humiliation, the way my life had been turned upside down by her actions. And that sympathy faded. She didn't look at me once. Whether that was shame, anger, or stubborn denial, I couldn't tell. The judge called the session to order, and just like that, the story we'd all been living moved into a new phase. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled slightly as I took the stand. I described the first police visit, the accusations, and the way they had impacted my daily life. I talked about documenting everything, about the sense of being watched, about how quickly people had believed the worst without evidence. The prosecutor asked clear, measured questions, guiding me through the timeline. Karen's attorney, on the other hand, tried to suggest misunderstandings, to frame the situation as a series of unfortunate coincidences. But facts have a way of grounding a story, and mine was supported by records, dates, and testimony from officers themselves. As the hearing continued, more information was presented about the stolen mail. Investigators outlined the scope of what had been found, the number of victims, and the length of time the thefts were believed to have occurred. Listening to it laid out so methodically was unsettling. but it felt chaotic and personal now. Appeared as part of a much larger, structured pattern. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. It was clear this wasn't being taken lightly. Outside the courtroom during a short recess, several neighbors approached me. Some thanked me for speaking up. Others admitted they were still trying to process everything. One woman told me she had blamed herself for months over late fees and missed notices, thinking she'd been careless. Now she knew it wasn't her fault. That moment hit me harder than I expected. Karen's actions hadn't just inconvenienced people, they had caused lasting stress and self-blame. Standing there, I realized that telling my story wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about giving others a sense of closure, too. Inside, the focus shifted to Karen's history of complaints and reports. Records showed a pattern of excessive, often unfounded calls to various authorities. The prosecutor argued that the false drug accusation against me wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader behavior of weaponizing systems meant to protect the community. Karen's attorney objected, trying to limit how much of that history could be considered. The legal back and forth was dense, but the underlying narrative was becoming unmistakable. This was about misuse of power, about how easily trust in institutions could be exploited. Throughout it all, Karen remained mostly silent. When she did speak, her words were defensive, clipped, and heavy with resentment. She insisted she had been misunderstood, that she had acted out of concern, not malice. The judge listened, expression unreadable. I watched her as she spoke, searching for any sign of accountability or regret. I didn't see it. Instead, I saw someone still convinced of her own righteousness, still unwilling to accept responsibility for the harm she had caused. By the end of the day, no final decisions were made. The judge scheduled additional hearings and set guidelines for evidence review. It was anticlimactic in a way, the lack of immediate resolution both frustrating and oddly expected. Legal processes rarely deliver neat endings. As I left the courthouse, I felt drained but lighter, as if I'd released something I'd been carrying for too long. Speaking the truth in that room, under oath, had given me a sense of agency I hadn't felt since before everything started. In the days that followed, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. The case lingered in the background, a constant hum of anticipation and stress, but it no longer dominated every thought. I focused on work, on reconnecting with friends, on reclaiming pieces of normalcy that had slipped away. Still, reminders surfaced unexpectedly: a letter from the prosecutor's office, a news update, a neighbor's anxious question. Each one tugged me back into the reality of what was still unfolding. What stayed with me most from that first hearing wasn't the arguments or the legal language. It was the realization of how thin the line is between order and chaos. One person's unchecked obsession had rippled outward, affecting dozens of lives. And while the system was finally responding, the damage couldn't simply be undone. As the next court date loomed, I sensed that the most revealing moments were still ahead. Moments that would test not just the facts of the case, but the willingness of everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, accountability, and the power of accusation. The weeks leading up to the next hearing were some of the strangest I had ever lived through. On the surface, things looked normal again. Cars came and went, kids played on the sidewalk, and packages were delivered without incident. But underneath that calm was a constant awareness that everything we were doing was temporary, suspended in a kind of emotional limbo until the case reached its conclusion. I found myself measuring time by legal updates instead of weekends, by phone calls from the prosecutor's office instead of social plans. Every envelope with an official seal made my pulse jump, even when it turned out to be routine paperwork. As the investigation deepened, more evidence surfaced, and with it came revelations that made the situation feel even heavier. Investigators uncovered that Karen had not only been stealing mail, but had also kept detailed notes about her neighbors. Schedules, habits, delivery patterns, things no one should know about the people living around them. When the detective mentioned this to me during a follow-up interview, I felt a cold wave wash over me. It explained so much: how she always seemed to know when a package arrived, how she timed her accusations, how confidently she spoke to authorities. This hadn't been random paranoia. It had been deliberate observation. Knowing that someone had been watching me that closely was unsettling in a way that lingered long after the conversation ended. I replayed past moments in my head, wondering how many times she'd been standing there, unnoticed, taking mental notes. The idea that she might have used that information to make her false report feel more convincing made me angry all over. Again, it wasn't just a lie, it was a constructed narrative, built carefully to cause maximum suspicion. That realization hardened something in me. Whatever lingering pity I'd felt disappeared completely. The second hearing was more intense than the first. This time, expert witnesses testified about the impact of mail theft and false reporting. A postal inspector explained how stolen mail could lead to identity theft, financial loss, and legal consequences for victims who never even knew their documents were missing. Listening to those details laid out so clinically made my chest tighten. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was a list of potential disasters that could have happened to any of us. The inspector also addressed how often mail theft goes unnoticed or unreported, making cases like this difficult to untangle. The judge listened closely, asking pointed questions that suggested a growing concern about the scale of the harm. When the topic turned to the false police reports, the room felt especially tense. Officers testified about responding to Karen's calls, about the lack of evidence, and about how her certainty and persistence initially gave her claims credibility. One officer admitted that repeated reports, even when unfounded, could create bias over time. Hearing that out loud was both validating and disturbing. Confirmed what I had felt from the beginning, that being accused repeatedly, even falsely, could slowly erode the presumption of innocence. That knowledge made me shiver. Not just for myself, but for anyone who might find themselves targeted in a similar way. Karen's defense tried to argue that her behavior stemmed from fear and concern, not malice. They painted her as someone overwhelmed by anxiety, someone who believed she was doing the right thing. The prosecutor countered with evidence of planning, of intentional actions that went far beyond reasonable concern. The contrast between those narratives was stark. Watching it unfold, I realized how easily intention could be twisted in hindsight. How someone could claim good motives while ignoring devastating outcomes. It was a sobering lesson in how accountability works or fails, too, when emotions are used as justification. During a break, I sat alone in a hallway, staring at a scuffed tile floor, trying to steady my breathing. I felt exposed, like pieces of my life had been laid out for strangers to examine. At the same time, I felt a growing sense of resolve. I hadn't chosen this role, but I wasn't going to shrink from it either. What had happened to me mattered, and staying silent would only make it easier for something like this to happen again to someone else. Outside the courthouse, reporters had started showing up. They asked neighbors questions, speculated about motives, and reduced complex events into bite-sized narratives. I avoided them as much as possible, but snippets of coverage still found their way to me. Some comments were supportive, others were careless or judgmental. Reading them was a mistake I only made once. I quickly learned that public opinion, like rumor, often ignores nuance in favor of drama. Protecting my own mental health meant stepping back and focusing on what I could control. Back at home, the neighborhood continued its slow process of healing. People were more communicative now, more willing to check in with each other instead of making assumptions. We shared information about suspicious activity, not in a panicked way, but with a sense of collective responsibility. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I found comfort in small routines, morning coffee, evening walks, familiar work tasks that reminded me life could still be steady, even amid uncertainty. As the case moved closer to its final stages, I was informed that sentencing recommendations were being prepared pending a verdict. The reality of consequences began to feel tangible. I thought about what justice would look like, not just in terms of punishment, but in terms of prevention. No sentence could undo the stress, the fear, or the fractured trust, but maybe it could. Send a message. Maybe it could draw a clear line between vigilance and violation, between concern and control. The night before what was expected to be the final hearing, I barely slept. My mind churned with questions and what-ifs. Would Karen finally acknowledge what she'd done? Would the court fully grasp the impact of her actions? Would I feel relief when it was over, or just emptiness? Lying there in the dark, I realized that whatever the outcome, I had already changed. I was more cautious, more aware of how fragile reputations and routines could be. But I was also stronger, more confident in my ability to stand up for myself when it mattered. As dawn crept in, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The truth had come this far, carried by evidence, testimony, and persistence. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't erase the past, but it might finally draw a boundary around it. And as I got ready to face the last stage of this ordeal, I sensed that the ending, whatever form it took, would force all of us to reckon with the cost of unchecked suspicion and the quiet damage it leaves behind. The final hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Karen sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, hands clenched tightly, eyes darting occasionally toward the judge, but never meeting mine. I took a deep breath as I entered the room, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. This was at the moment where months of fear, false accusations, and stolen mail would finally be addressed in full. The judge called the session to order, and the room fell silent. Every witness, every piece of evidence, every account of wrongdoing was laid out systematically, leaving no room for doubt. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that the truth had been clear from the beginning, but also aware that the final decision would shape not just Karen's future, but the neighborhood's sense of safety and trust. The prosecutor presented the timeline, connecting the dots between Karen's repeated false reports and the stolen mail discovered in her garage. Officers recounted the initial visits to my house, the lack of evidence, and how her accusations had escalated over time. Postal inspector detailed the stolen items, the impact on the victims, and the potential legal consequences of her actions. As I listened, I felt a quiet vindication. Every anxious hour, every sleepless night, every worried thought about what people might believe about me now had led to this moment. I had been right, and the evidence made that undeniable. Karen's defense attorney attempted to cast her behavior as a series of misunderstandings, emphasizing her supposed intentions and minimizing the harm caused. But the judge was thorough, asking pointed questions that left little room for ambiguity. The sheer volume of evidence, the stolen mail, witness statements, police records, and documentation I had kept made her claims difficult to sustain. I watched as her composure faltered, a stark contrast to the confident, accusatory persona she had displayed for months. It was a powerful reminder of how accountability has a way of catching up, even when denial seems endless. When it came time for the victim impact statements, neighbors spoke about the fear, frustration, and inconvenience caused by Karen's actions. One woman described missing financial documents that had put her in real jeopardy, while another recounted weeks of stress over undelivered legal notices. I shared my experience last, describing the false police reports, the daily anxiety, the sense of being publicly vilified for no reason. Speaking aloud, the full impact of her behavior felt empowering. It was more than just clearing my name. It was reclaiming a sense of control that had been stolen alongside the mail and peace of mind. The judge took time to review all the testimony and evidence before delivering a verdict. Karen was found guilty on multiple counts, including mail, theft, and filing false police reports. Sentencing would follow, but the conviction alone felt like a significant milestone. The sense of justice, while not erasing the months of fear and stress, brought a weight off my shoulders. The courtroom, once heavy with tension, seemed to release a collective breath as the judgment sank in. There was relief not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood, for the people whose private correspondence had been violated, and for the community that had been subjected to her manipulations. As the hearing concluded, Karen was escorted out of the courtroom, her voice subdued, and her protests reduced to whispers. The weight of accountability finally rested on her, and it was impossible not to feel a sense of closure. I left the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. The community, too, seemed to regain a sense of normalcy. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks, shared small smiles, and began rebuilding the trust that had been eroded. Security cameras, locked mailboxes, and watchful cooperation became practical lessons rather than symbols of fear. The street had endured a test of patience, integrity, and vigilance, and now it could begin to heal. Back at home, I sat quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. The months of stress, false accusations, and fear of judgment had left. Scars, but they had also taught resilience, the importance of documentation, and the power of truth. I realized that speaking up, documenting my experience, and trusting the investigative process had made the difference. The ordeal had been exhausting and frightening, but it had also shown me that persistence and honesty could overcome lies and manipulation. If you're facing false accusations or harassment, remember that staying calm, keeping records, and seeking support can protect you. Lies can feel overwhelming when they start, but truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes in ways you might not expect. Stand firm, document everything, and let the evidence speak for you. Life will test you, sometimes in ways that feel impossible, but the truth has a resilience all its own. And for anyone watching this story unfold, know that justice, though slow, has a way of catching up, and the truth will eventually prevail.